Hey, what's up, guys? My name's John. Welcome to Daily Theology. Voddie Baucham, a person that I greatly respect and admire for many reasons, thinks that America is on the verge of a race war. And this is a long article, but I think it's very helpful because his recent book, Fault Lines, is doing phenomenally well. And the reason is it breaks down critical race theory and the ideas of white privilege. So I want to go through the article and kind of set up, I believe, why he wrote the book. And then he gives a definition of terms, which is always the key ingredient in any discussion like this, because what you often find is the battle is always over language. And when you live in a culture where words are fluid and have no actual meaning and the dictionary is being updated all the time, it's very difficult to have a honest conversation with people because it's usually not presented in an above-board way. So his book is number one in several Christian categories, including, it says here, listed among the top 100 best-selling books on the e-commerce website of Amazon. 95% of those who have reviewed the book gave it a 5-star rating. Now, if you've ever done anything for the public, that is very good. 5 stars from 95% of the people is very good. So the book originally was rejected by a publisher and then picked up by another publisher that had the courage to carry it. And Voddie, as you know, has had medical issues, so continue to pray for him. But he, I love how straightforward he is in so many areas. And there's very little that I've heard from Voddie over the years that I don't agree with. I'm not saying I agree with everything he says. I'm just saying when I read his books and things, I'm usually like, yeah, I understand what he's saying and I would agree with him. So in this book, he talks about critical race theory, and here's a definition from Purdue University's one of their experts here, and it's a theoretical and interpretive mode that examines the appearance of race and racism across dominant culture modes of expression. In adopting this approach, CRT scholars attempt to understand how victims of systemic racism are affected by the cultural perceptions of race and how they're able to represent themselves to counter prejudice. So, baked into this assumption, you're all racist. And now, there is some truth to this idea of looking at inequalities within a culture between people groups. There's only one race, the human race. But there's, Voddie says it later in the article, but there's always going to be inequalities because you have different groups of people coming together. And so one group is going to have some advantages. And if you look back through history, I often find it interesting that the Jewish people are not mentioned here. They were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, and yet I never yet have heard anyone cry for reparations for the Jewish people. 400 years. Slavery has been sadly normative. Now, there are different types of slavery throughout history, and some are much worse than others. And obviously what we had here in the U.S. was very bad. It was evil. It was wrong. And so nobody's debating that fact. But Voddie goes on to talk about this thing that the SBC passed, and he calls it Resolution 9, or excuse me, that's what it's called, Resolution 9. He says it was unfortunate, and there are a lot of things that led to Resolution 9 being passed that had nothing to do with whether or not the SBC believes or agrees with CRT and intersectionality. So I'm hopeful there will be an appropriate response at the convention next month because this stuff is poison. This stuff is deadly. It corrodes and destroys everything it touches. He's right. This whole idea, this is a wedge to get in between people and pull them apart. And I was telling my family the other day that it's not hard to get people to get angry at each other. Sinful people naturally get angry, and all you have to do is provide the spark. It's like a forest fire waiting to happen. And the only cure for this, of course, is a regenerated heart by the gospel, because only somebody that's been redeemed by God's grace can offer grace to others and kindness and love, and the hope of the gospel ultimately being the redemptive tool that God uses to regenerate his people. So obviously this is a hard issue, but even if you step back from this, engaging in this video could actually promote the agenda of CRT and intersectionality. And you say, well, how? Well, it's easy. The goal is to cause division. And so if you watch this video and there are 800 people that like it or whatever, 10 people, 5 people, and they comment, and then there's 4 people that they don't like it, well, now you're playing right into the hands of the Marxists, which is to set one side against the other, the haves versus the have-nots, the ones that have been privileged versus the unprivileged. And in a sense, there will always be inequality in this life. There can be equality of value because people are made in the image of God, but there cannot be an equality of outcomes. As I've said many times, people have different levels of gifts and abilities, and if you attempt to artificially conflate those and make them equal, basically you're going to handicap this guy. Imagine, I'm not a big golf guy, but I saw Phil, fellow left-handed golfer, which I'm not any good at all, but Phil won a major championship at age 50, which is something no one had ever done. And so imagine saying, Phil, hey, you're really good at golf. You've practiced your whole life. You've worked so hard. You've probably given up a ridiculous amount of things to be this good. But, you know, we're going to give Carl over there 20 strokes on you because, look, we want this to be equal. That's crazy. Phil has worked his whole life. He had talent. He worked hard. He did the right thing, and he won the tournament. That's how it's supposed to work. You don't give somebody more strokes just because they're not good golfers. And so just because you're born with a certain ethnicity doesn't mean you're naturally privileged. Doesn't even mean you're white. I've heard people use the intersectionality tools. It's how many intersections are you oppressed by, and then that determines your social status. And that there's automatically this undercurrent of oppressive racism. Look, America is the most free, most opportunity-laden land in the entire world that the world has ever seen. And for people to come along and say, look, we need to tear it down and start over, it's because they want their own kingdom. It's not because they have anything better to offer. They don't have anything better. It's destruction. And Jesus said that the thief comes to kill, steal, and destroy. And if you look at what people have been doing lately, well, they're killing, stealing, and destroying. So you can figure out what side I think this is from. I think it's evil. And Baucham says this thing should be totally rejected. He says the four main premises here of critical race theory are things that we have to completely reject. The idea that racism is normal and unavoidable and ubiquitous in the United States, and its history is the idea that white people are incapable of righteous actions on race unless their interests converge. You can't get more anti-biblical than that, Baucham explained. Agreed. That is a horrendous statement. They reject objectivity and meritocracy. Okay, that word's beyond my ability. And their main idea is that we ascertain truth through narratives. Again, your lived experience. And this is why I love Dr. MacArthur, because from the beginning, he has pointed out that this is ridiculous. Your experience doesn't determine truth. Your experience doesn't determine reality in any way. But that is the meta-narrative of our culture. It's, okay, my experience, somehow determines what's true for me. And I totally reject that. God's word determines what's true for everyone. Whether you accept that premise or not doesn't matter. God is God and you are not. And Jesus is king, whether you make him king or not. Now, it's very helpful for you to be born again into his kingdom. I would strongly encourage that, to repent and believe the gospel, because Jesus lived a perfect sinless life, bore the wrath of God on the cross, died, and rose on the third day. But critical race theory is evil. It really is. And so is intersectionality. It's a racist ideology. And he says this is hugely problematic because these are essentially arguing that the Bible is not sufficient on the issue of race, ethnicity, racism, etc., that CRT is needed to inform the scriptures on these particular issues. No, it's not. It is not. Now, can we learn things from other people? Of course. Do people have real issues and have they been wronged? Of course. Do we need them as analytical tools to use to understand the Bible? No, never. This is terrible. So he says, I couldn't disagree more with people who try to take that third way of middle ground. He said, there is no third or middle ground with CRT and intersectionality. Now on to the spicy meatball. That's a spicy meatball. White privilege. I was explaining to my wife the other day that white privilege is the narrative of our culture. And she said, I've never even heard of this. And I said, well, honey, you live in this culture, so this is what people are saying. And, it's what they're saying and attempting to use as a wedge to get what they want. It's basically a hammer. You just keep, you're white. Well, I mean, how do people even know that we're not Native American? And in fact, I have some Native American in my history. It doesn't matter. I don't identify, I'm this or that. We're people that have rebelled against God. Some of us have European descent. Some of us have different ancestries. But the value of the person is not in the amount of melanin or in their culture. It's in the fact that God has made them for a relationship with himself. There's only one race, the human race. And the idea that we need to elevate one ethnicity over another in itself is racist by its definition. One of the most absurd things to ever happen was Title IX. And I remember in college I wrote papers on it in English class, and I was against it because I coached sports, and all the wrestling programs were getting crushed because they had to have girls' foosball instead of wrestling teams. And so from the very beginning, that was not equal. It was targeting certain things to try to get equal outcomes. And now they're trying to repeal Title IX because the boys can't be girls. It's crazy. And when you look at these things, they're trying to say, look, we've been sinned against. And the problem with this, as MacArthur points out, and any biblical person should see, is that it removes personal guilt and responsibility. And the idea of reparations and all of these things from the Old Testament kind of dragged forward, carried forward into our day to say these things are owed. They're not owed. And I don't see it as a biblically convincing argument for people to carry that forward as a reason to promote this conversation. If it's within your ability to help someone and you want to help them, then by all means, please help them. Should we try to help others? Absolutely. But when it's used as a club and a sword to advance a godless agenda, and you're behind that as a Christian, I think you're making a huge mistake. Now, that's my opinion. I know it's more complicated than that in the Old Testament. I know there are people groups that are used, and God's using nations to judge nations, but ultimately that's God doing it for his purposes. You're not God, so please don't pretend to have that idea and then carry it forward to apply to whatever pet issue that you think it should be given reparations. We've seen the NFL and the NBA, all these professional sports organizations have committed brand suicide. I don't understand why in any way these people are embracing these things, other than there's some sort of spiritual delusion. I don't see the business case, just from a human perspective, for these companies that are predominantly basically employing African-American athletes that are really good at what they do, and they're turning on the people that watch their sports and their games and things like that. It's crazy. And we saw that with the All-Star game. So I think the problem when people say racial inequality, and that was over voter integrity, I think the problem when people say racial inequality, what they're referring to is the idea that disparate outcome equals injustice. And that's not true. The Bible specifically says that some people do the right things and sometimes they don't prosper, sometimes they do the wrong things and they prosper. It's not injustice. God is not unjust in that way. We live in a sinful world, though, and sinful people are unjust. And so the problem is at the root of humanity, not at somebody else's fault. And here it says, Baucham boldly tackles the issue in this book. In addressing the issue of disparity and policing, Baucham takes high-profile cases highlighted in mainstream media of black people killed by police, such as Tamir Rice, Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Philando Castile, and compares them to similar cases where the victims are white but don't get any media attention. Have you heard of Tony Timpa? Like Floyd, Timpa was wailed and pleaded for help for more than 30 times as officers pinned his shoulders and knees, neck to the ground, reported the Dallas Morning News in August 2016. Timpa, a 32-year-old schizophrenic, called the police himself, saying he was off his meds and needed help when police arrived. He'd been handcuffed by a security guard. Anyways, this goes on. Sounds a lot like George Floyd. The George Floyd case was indeed tragic. However, it was not unique, nor does it represent clear evidence of a particular pattern of police brutality regarding black men. No one took to Twitter demanding that the Christian leaders prove their bona fides by speaking out on the Timpa case, and no one wrote articles leading Christian publications about losing sleep over it. In fact, few, if any, people who mounted their moral high horses and took to the streets in protest over Floyd even knew of Timpa's name. Why? Because he was white and his case did not advance the right narrative. Baucham is the man. And if you don't know, he's a giant black man. He's very kind. And he also does, I think, jiu-jitsu. So don't mess with him. He played football, but he's theologically astute, and he's not afraid to call a spade a spade. And here again, he's pointing out just, if you're talking about equality of outcomes for all these people, where's the equality in the outcome of the way you cover cases and things like that? And again, there's always going to be injustice. So if this is a game where I play this card and then you play this card and then you play this card, it never ends. This results in what he's saying, a race war, because there's always going to be something that happens next. And the mainstream media, to advance a Marxist agenda, just grabs those and just throws it like sand in your eyes in order to distract you from the real issue of the human heart and unity that is in the gospel when people repent and believe. This is the issue. It's a spiritual battle, and this is just a hammer driving home a godless agenda. Here we talk about cultural Marxism. These ideologies have taken root in academia that are now being talked about in popular culture by people who have no idea where they came from. This is true. And no idea what these things mean, and no idea how antithetical they are to biblical Christianity. This is a threat. This is a wolf. And my job as a shepherd is to fight off wolves. That's true. The pastor does two things, according to the book of 2 Peter. They feed the sheep and they protect the sheep. And so you need to protect the sheep from this ideology. You need to feed the sheep with accurate theological teaching. So cultural Marxism is very bad. His job is to fight off the wolf. And that has nothing to do with echo chambers of want or please or certain kinds of people. If anything, this book is the opposite of that. There are many echo chambers happening right now in evangelicalism. He further pointed out that despite being evangelical, his positions have made him an outsider in the evangelical community, which is strange because he's basically holding to biblical Christianity here and a conservative view of reality, and I believe the right view on things here. Popular evangelicalism is woke. So most of these things I'm pointing out put me on the outside of the echo chamber, not the inside. I'm not going to be invited to Crew or InterVarsity or the Gospel Coalition. I could run down the list. I'm not going to be invited by any of those things. The premier place is evangelicalism, he said. Forget the SBC, forget the PCA. Southern Baptist Seminary couldn't hire me today because of all those ideas. They would be completely pillared if they hired me. Pilloried? I don't even know that word. His vocabulary is beyond me. So for me, so far, from writing for an echo chamber, I'm actually speaking out, pulling myself outside of the echo chamber, which is good. Baucham, who has spent 6 weeks recovering from the heart surgery, spoke with CP, said he believes this book is resonating with evangelicals because many people are still grappling with the social justice movement. We're not grappling with it. I strongly dislike it, and dislike's the kindest word I can use. I haven't divided up the people in terms of how many black people or how many white people I've heard from, but I've heard from people across the spectrum, and regardless of people's color, what I've heard from people is this is a real issue, it's a real problem, and I've wanted to be able to wrap my head around it, and you helped me wrap my head around it, he said. So, for black Christians who don't agree with the narrative of the social justice movement, Baucham penned an op-ed for the New York Post why anti-racism zealots are trying to silence black voices like mine. His voice on the issue has been a blessing, so good for Baucham. In terms of some black people, they've recognized if they speak out on this issue, they get their head chopped off. They're called sellouts, or Uncle Toms, obviously, that's just, it's ugh. And so a lot of them are staying in the shadows because it's just not safe to speak out on the issues, he said. They've been very grateful to have another black Christian to speak out against this, and somebody who has a platform, if you will. In terms of white Christians, you've been seeing similar things where they're going. I don't agree with this narrative, and the minute they say I don't agree, they're called racist. I'm called white supremacist, so on and so forth. So I think on all sides of this, because of the nature, what's been going on, a lot of people feel like this has given them a voice. Like many evangelicals, Baucham sees the use of critical race theory by Christians as a threat to the gospel. This is the most important part, if you're still watching this thing. He wasn't afraid to highlight the names of prominent evangelicals in this book, who he sees on both sides of the divide to which currently sees no real resolution or solution. Why are people in groups like Tabidi Aniwiwe, I know his name, I just can't say it, Tabidi Aniwiwe, Tim Keller, Russell Moore, the Southern Baptist Convention, Ethics Religious Commission, 9 Marks, the Gospel Coalition, Together for the Gospel, being identified with critical social justice on one side of the fault, and people like MacArthur. I don't know Tom Askell, but great for him. Owen Strachan, Douglas Wilson, and the late R.C. Sproul being identified on the other. You gotta love R.C. Sproul. He's still fighting from heaven here. This is great. And I love MacArthur and Sproul, so I'm on that side. And I do think this is an issue where you're not angry, this is the whole thing. It's creating a wedge between Christians. But you do have to recognize you can't be on the other side of this issue. It's not wise, it's not helpful, in my opinion, to be on the other side of the social justice aisle. It's an evil position. It's opposed to the gospel. Therefore, I oppose it because it's at the very core opposed to my most dearly held belief, which is the gospel, which can reconcile people. And so there's a divide between these camps. I've been to T4G. I'm not going back. I think I've been twice, but I'm not going to go back to that thing. The Gospel Coalition, I'm grateful for a lot of their stuff, but I'm not really going to look at their things anymore. And Douglas Wilson, a lot of people think he's a bit extreme, but he writes blog and may blog, and he's right on most stuff. That's the thing. I'm not saying everything, but he's very intuitive. If you haven't checked out his stuff, MacArthur obviously is a great guy to look to. It's not a stretch to see we are seeing seismic shifts in the evangelical landscape, but it's an exaggeration to call this a coming catastrophe. I don't think so, he writes. The divide is so strong, Baucham argues, because America is on the verge of a race war. Now, this is interesting. He said, I've pursued justice my entire Christian life, yet I'm about as anti-social justice as they come, not because I've abandoned my obligation to strive for peace with everyone and for holiness without which no one will see the Lord, Hebrews 12:14, because I believe the current concept of social justice is incompatible with biblical Christianity. Agreed, he argues in the book. This is the main fault line at the root of the current debate, the epicenter, the big one, the one that when it finally shifts with all its force threatens to split evangelicalism right down the middle. Our problem is a lack of clarity and charity in our debate over the place, priority, practice, and definition of justice. Agreed. And this is why the atonement, you see, the lamb for the liars, the just for the unjust, the righteous for the unrighteous. This is the actual definition of justice. No one is woke enough to be just like Jesus. Jesus is the just propitiator of our sins. On the cross, he canceled the choreographer, the handwriting of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. You cannot be more just than Jesus. You're not even close. This is why social justice will always fail. It's a self-righteous ideology, and it's a racist ideology. So he says it is against the gospel. The United States is on the verge of a race war, if not a complete cultural meltdown. He's right. And the rest of the Western world seems to be following suit. Tensions are rising in every place. The African slave trade has left its indelible mark. Earlier this year, another prominent black Southern Baptist leader, Pastor Dwight McKissick, who founded and leads Cornerstone Baptist Church, and where Baucham previously worked, according to his book, cut ties with the Southern Baptists of Texas Convention over its strongly worded anti-CRT policy that denounces all aspects of critical race theory. Well, good for them. And warned that if leaders at the Southern Baptist Convention rescind Resolution 9 on critical race theory, their convention next month, he would cut ties with them too. So that's sad for Baucham's church that he helped. That announcement came amid an exodus of prominent black SBC pastors such as Ralph West. So these guys are leaving. Baucham says, well, they weren't that closely tied in, is what he says. And here's the main point. He says, I guess my message would be they need to go wherever their conscience dictates, he said. You don't change the SBC by leaving. It's one of the most diverse religious organizations in the world, and you don't change it by leaving. For Christians who read his book, Baucham, who plans on heading back to Lusaka in mid to late June, wants them to get from the message that the gospel is under attack. This is the core issue. This is why I did a 24-minute video. We are at war because this ideology is at war with the gospel. It's at war with Scripture. And so I wanted people to see that. I wanted people to see that this book is about that this is about so much more than just black people saying things one way, seeing things one way. White people see things another way. Asians see things another way. It's about much more than that. And what's ironic is that the rest of the culture is waking up to this, he said. There are legislators now writing the law dealing with CRT because they see it as a poison. And yet Christians are still sitting around saying, well, useful analytical tool or third way nuance. That's why I chose the fault lines metaphor, the idea of an earthquake that's coming that's going to divide even more than it already has. On the one hand, I don't want to see brothers and sisters divide. On the other hand, I absolutely want to see a clear divide between the truth of the gospel and the lie of CRT and anti-racism. I don't always applaud articles, but when Voddie Baucham wrote this one, I think he deserves our admiration and our appreciation, because this is exactly what a leader does. A leader calls out the wolf, and a leader directly addresses the wolf. We don't sit back and go, I don't want to cause issues. And I don't know, this video could get us, bad feedback or whatever, but at the end of the day, God is sovereign, and I am going to speak what I think is true and right and good. And where there's an issue that needs to be addressed, I care more about the gospel and the truth than I do people's opinions. I'm glad if people like, this sort of discussion and agree with it. But if you don't, I'm sorry, I don't really care. I don't care, not because I don't care about you. I don't care because I'm trying to do the right thing before God. And when it comes to intersectionality and critical race theory, I have friends that I think are on the wrong side of this, like in a big way. And it's a gospel issue, and it's a racist ideology, and it's an evil ideology. And it's going to destroy so many privileges that this culture enables people that hate this. And they say, well, that's privilege. You live in the most privileged nation in the history of the world. You're trying to tear it apart. It's insanity. Now, ultimately, our hope is not in a nation. But if you don't recognize the Puritans' influence in founding this nation and God's sovereign grace in founding this nation on Judeo-Christian biblical ideas, and you try to throw that narrative away, you are ignorant of reality. And the gospel is under attack here. And the gospel has no allegiance to any flag. Jesus is king. He's the King of kings and Lord of lords. So if you haven't yet repented and trusted in the death, burial, and resurrection of the God-man Jesus Christ, who bore the hell and wrath that you deserve on the cross, canceling the record of debt, bringing people to himself once for all, for his glory, for all of eternity, make today the day. If you're still watching this, please remember to hammer that like button, like the 95 Theses, and subscribe to the channel. We would greatly appreciate it. We're trying to reach lots of people with the gospel. God bless.